democracy's data. You guys can all do.
Thank you. Thank you, Cameron. All right. Thank you all for being here, for joining us for this session. Really excited about this panel that we have. We're going to have a great conversation around the decennial census and why it's so important and related to civic health. And before I introduce my esteemed panelists, I'm a huge census nerd. I see some census nerds in the crowd. But for those of you, for those of you who don't know how incredibly important the census is, I'll share just a few words and then we'll jump in. So the census is the backbone of American democracy. It lays the foundation for allocating political representation, redrawing state and local districts, and census-derived data sets help us allocate over $2 trillion in federal funding into communities every year. The data also serve as the cornerstone for nearly all other federal statistics, so especially the American Community Survey, for example. And that means that they inform everything from civil rights enforcement, government planning, economic development, nonprofit and academic research, and so much more. They're a vital tool for understanding our nation's needs and developing solutions to our toughest problems. My friend Dan here described the census recently as being sort of like being a sort of invisible infrastructure. So sort of like the cables and wires that allow us to make phone calls. We don't see them, but without them, our voices can't be heard, right? And so when we think about infrastructure, it's one of those things that is often invisible when it's working well. And the census can be thought of kind of similarly in that way. So in the years between the decennial census counts, the census often fades from the public's attention, but decisions that are happening in these quieter moments, in the intercensal years, as we call them, are really important. They're going to have a huge impact on how accurate and fair the decennial data are, and because of that, how well the data reflect the state of our democracy and the state of our nation. This is the only time that we try to count every single person that lives here, and so it's really important that we get it right. So that is why we're here talking about the census today. So I am thrilled to introduce our panel. First, Megan Morey, currently with the Office of the Undersecretary of Economic Affairs at the Department of Commerce and bringing extensive experience on census issues in the nonprofit sector. Today, Megan joins us in their personal capacity. Thank you for being here. Dr. Janine Abrams-McClain, President of Fair Count, whose leadership has been instrumental in ensuring every community has a voice in our democracy. And last but not least, we have Dr. Dan Bouk, historian, chair of history at Colgate University, and author of Democracy's Data, The Hidden Stories in the U.S. Census and How to Read Them. Let's welcome our panel. So to start us off, I want to start with sort of an open-ended question for each of you, maybe starting with you, Megan. What does the census mean for you, and how do you encounter it in your work?
Well, currently I encounter it by having oversight over the Census Bureau, but that is not what brought me to this work. I started doing census work many, many years ago when I was working at an LGBTQ organization and doing advocacy around criminal justice and economic justice policy. And it was so hard for us to convince members of Congress and other decision makers to make change in those areas around LGBTQ folks because we didn't have any data to back up the things that we were saying. So we would go in and share narratives about the needs of our community, and they would say, great, but how many people does that impact? Show me the numbers. And we couldn't. So I started working on census issues in order to resolve that, and then I got hooked. Because it's fascinating, and it really does impact every component of federal policy, as well as a lot of state and local policy. And we'll talk about that more as we go, but that's sort of how I got there in the first place.
Thanks. Janine?
Hi, everyone. The census means real power to me, power for communities that have not had an opportunity to build power or to wield the power that they have. Prior to starting Fair Count with Rebecca DeHart, wave your hand, you thought I wasn't going to say anything, our CEO at Fair Count, I worked at the CDC and as an evolutionary biologist, and you would see all these like health disparities, right? And there wasn't always data to sort of back it up. And once I was pulled over to the census world, I was like, well, here's the data, right? Here are the reasons why we see these disparities, not just in public health, but in education, in communities where you have a natural disaster, and on the black side of town, there are no FEMA trucks, but they're on the white side of town. The census actually shows us the data, but it's not just accepting that there are disparities in the data. The way that we work at Fair Count with the census is we are trying to make sure that everybody is counted, which is why in the intercensal years, we're still talking about the census. Whether we're working on redistricting or on elections, we are still constantly talking about the census because it's so important for people to understand that that is the bedrock of civic power in our country.
So I'm a historian, so that the census can be data for me, but in a way, I'm more drawn to it as looking at one of the crucial moments, one of the only moments when every American, at least should, have an opportunity to make themselves known to the nation, to the government. And so when all of you who were in the United States in 2020 were hopefully counted, at that moment, your data is held very confidential and your individual information does not leak out in any way. But after 72 years, snoops like me can see those responses and use them as a way to try to understand what's happening in this process. And I think, therefore, of a census as this doorstep encounter, this moment where people are talking, making themselves known. And so I'm going to illustrate that very briefly with a little poem by Langston Hughes from after the 1940 census called Madam and the Census Man. The census man, the day he came round, wanted my name to put it down. I said Johnson, Alberta K, but he hated to write my name that way. He said, what does K stand for? I said K, and nothing more. He said, I'm going to put it K-A-Y. I said, if you do, you lie. My mother christened me Alberta K. You leave my name just that way. He said, Mrs. with a snort. Just a K makes your name too short. I said, I don't give a damn. Leave me and my name just as I am. Furthermore, rub out that Mrs. too. I'll have you know I'm a madam to you.
Thank you so much for that great selection from Langston Hughes. Dan, in Democracy's Data, you explore how the census is a sort of mirror reflecting the state of our democracy. Could you tell us what can the census teach us about the gaps between our democratic ideals and reality?
Big question. I'll do it in a little way. I mean, a census seems like it produces facts. It does. It seems like it produces numbers. It does. But it is also a process. And when we look at that process, I think is when we really allows us to see more about how our democracy is working and how it is not working. Part of that process is the planning process. So Megan talking about the voices that cannot be heard. Who is in the room deciding how the census will be constructed? What kinds of categories are possible? How do we take our complex identities and find a way to fit them into a social reality that allows us to plan for a nation? That's one part of it. Another part is that moment at those doorstops or where you're filling out a form online and you're trying to explain yourself, that moment of collection. And that should be this great moment where every single person is counted. But we know, as we'll talk about later, that in fact there have been persistent undercounts which make it such that those who already are marginalized tend to be marginalized more by not being counted again. And then there's the process of thinking about how this data comes to be used. And there's all kinds of different questions there. One of my particular hobby horses is the way in which census data, when they are released, are fed into an automatic process which then determines how many seats every state has in the House of Representatives and how many votes in the Electoral College. That automatic process has been in place for about 100 years, and as a result, there remain only 435 seats in the US House, even though there are 3 times as many Americans as there were before that. And that's a way in which then people cannot be known by their Congress people who are meant to represent them, as more and more people face a smaller and smaller group of representatives.
Thanks, Ann. To continue talking a little bit about sort of the political importance of the census, Janine, what can you tell us about why census data is so important for redistricting and what that means for communities?
So if you're not aware, after the census count is used to redraw political lines. In the last redistricting, and these are political lines from federal lines, for congressional lines, all the way down to school boards. And again, when you have these persistent undercounts, primarily in communities of color, it impacts what Carol was saying, it impacts your civil rights. And so when you have a fair count and you can then draw fair districts, that's how you get competitive races. That's where people get to try to elect officials that actually represent their values and their goals for their community. When you do gerrymandering, which is a funny word that just means unfair maps, then you, again, in those already marginalized and disenfranchised communities, you make it so that they can't put people in office that, or try to put people in office that represent them. I can talk about, the big Supreme Court case that was decided in 2020, when was that, recently, 2022, out of Alabama. But I want to give, part of my goal is for y'all to have like real life examples, or more local examples. In Georgia, after the 2010 census, there's a small county called Sumter County, primarily black, majority black county with 7 school board seats. And you would think in that county that the majority of those school board seats would be held by black school board members. In actuality, out of the 7 seats, after they gerrymandered the maps, there were 2 held by black school board members and 5 held by white school board members. It took almost a decade for this to go through the courts, the federal courts, to then get a ruling that the drawing of those lines violated the Voting Rights Act through racial discrimination. But that entire time, right, you still have to wait all of that time to even try and get representation. And when they were interviewing people in the towns or in the county, there were, again, disparities between the whiter parts of towns and the schools in the whiter part of town and the schools in the black part of town. And so again, if you continue to perpetuate this, these unfair, or these persistent undercounts of people, and then you use that bad data, which is what it is, and you manipulate it to make it so that the lines aren't drawn fairly, you are impacting not just at this big federal level when we think of the decennial census, but you're impacting small communities around the country. And so I think that's why we have to, we joke, that Rebecca and I, that the redistricting cycle seems to never end, but that's why we have to, again, keep talking about census, redistricting, and making sure that people are aware of it when problems arise, so that just like you get motivated and engaged and mobilized around an election, you do the same thing around the census, and you do the same thing around redistricting in your communities.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm going to switch gears a little bit. Megan, we know that a lot of marginalized communities worry sometimes about how their data might be used. What can we do to ensure that that data is secure, but also that we are inclusive of marginalized communities that might have some really valid concerns, potentially? And what can we do to try to build trust?
Yeah, and I think this is a huge concern for a lot of communities. And I have worked closely with a lot of colleagues on a range of census issues over the years, but most closely with organizations from the Arab American community that were fighting for better data on Middle Eastern and North African folks. along the same timeline and horizon as we were fighting for work on sexual orientation and gender identity. So we found it really beneficial to work together as we learned the processes of how to make these changes over time. And yay, we just succeeded in changing Statistical Policy Directive 15, so we will have better data on Middle Eastern and North African folks from the upcoming census. So exciting. Still working on sexual orientation and gender identity, but we'll get there. But one of the things I hear most often when I was organizing around census in community was people saying, is it even safe for me to answer these questions if the federal government is asking them? And I think that is really reflective of a sea change we've seen in people's trust in government. I think that's more of a concern for people now than it has been in the past. But I think what has been really important for me personally is to think about the collection of data and the use of data as two separate entities, and think about how we shore up trust on both sides of that equation. So when we're collecting data, we want to make sure people feel comfortable in that moment talking about their identity and filling out the survey and really understand the value, the positive value of participating in this form of civic engagement. And we as advocates and attorneys and sort of people in the realm of federal government need to make sure that the protections on how those data are used are very, very strong. Fortunately, right now, there is quite a strong legal landscape around how those data are used. Not only does Title 13 prevent any public disclosure of anything that's personally identifiable, so the actual data that you fill out on the census, as Dan mentioned. But there's also a whole web of regulations and laws that prevent statistical agencies from using that data for anything that's not creating statistics. So they can't hand the data off to immigration services or any other entity for a harmful use. That doesn't mean that people will not misuse the data. We know that after September 11th, that people used aggregate data about Arab Americans to conduct inquiries in communities. There will always be people who are misusing data, and we need to be mindful of that. But I think helping people understand where the risks are so that they can feel empowered to make their own decision about how to participate in this is really, I think, our long-term best solution.
Yeah, thanks. So we've talked a lot about just how important the census is, but we also know that we have some really deep and persistent undercounts, particularly of people of color, but also others, people experiencing homelessness, poverty, renters, people in rural areas. What do you all see as the work that needs to be done to close some of those gaps as we move forward into the future?
I can't speak to the future, but I can say really briefly.
Ask a historian about the future.
Yeah, how we got here. There have been undercounts since there's been a census, but the first real inkling in a serious way that there was a persistent and differential undercount, one that hurt particular populations more than others, was from African American researchers in the Census Bureau in the 1910s, who were among the first who did some research looking at the late 19th century, 1870, 1890 censuses, and found patterns, particularly in the American South, that suggested to them that African Americans were not being counted at the same rate as white Americans in the South. And then right here in Washington, D.C., one of the great black public intellectuals, the professor at Howard University, the mathematician Kelly Miller in 1922, looked back at the 1920 census and made a similarly powerful case that African Americans were still not being significantly undercounted. After 1940, then, other researchers compared surveys of people who were signing up to be drafted to the actual census counts, and assuming that then for these kind of men of a certain age, you're more likely to find somebody who's forced to admit that they could be drafted than necessarily find them in the census. Comparing those showed a 3% overall undercount of Americans and a close to 15% undercount of young African American men from that sample. And since then, the Census Bureau, since the 1950s, has started to accurately and more systematically try to map that persistent undercount, but it continues to be persistent, and as we know, affects not just African Americans, but a variety of different groups. I won't say any more there.
A whole lot. But I do want to start with, we worked with NCOC, Allison, at Fair Count, and also with our partner, our sister organization, the Southern Economic Advancement Project. Hey, Sarah Beth, on a series called Pandemic to Prosperity South, and where we looked at 12 states in the South. We looked at census, voting, all kinds of, and obviously the pandemic. But one of the things that I think we need to focus on going into the next census, especially in rural communities of color in the South, is one, access to the internet, right? So 2020 was the first time that the census was done primarily online, and it'll be primarily online in the next one, but there's a massive digital divide across the South. And while there are funds coming in to states across the country to, improve broadband equity, there are inevitably going to be some disparities, and they will likely impact rural communities and rural communities of color that don't get access to those funds. And so we need to make sure that people can actively participate in the census by having access to the internet ahead of 2030. The other thing that we looked at in Pandemic to Prosperity South was news deserts. So I think the last time we looked at it, 75% of southern counties were considered news deserts, meaning that they had either no or only one source of local news. And as you know, we talk about it with elections, but mis and disinformation are just as nefarious when it comes to census participation. And so when you combine that and you overlay the digital divide with these news deserts, if we don't find a way to combat that ahead of 2030, we are going to be, again, working against two formidable walls, one of digital access and the other one of access to accurate information. And those are going to be pivotal to making sure that we get a fair and accurate count in 2030.
I like that you, Dan, made the connection to what people inside the Census Bureau were able to do to lift up what was happening within their own communities. I've seen some of this happening at Census in the last decade or so, too, around some other undercounted communities. And one that really stands out for me is you mentioned renters being undercounted. Mm-hmm. We know that people who are renting just generally tend to have less stable addresses than people who aren't. And I think there are a lot of folks in Census who have had the experience themselves of living in many different houses over the years. I did a quick count with a friend the other day, and I lived in 22 places in 19 years. And I feel like that is the case for a lot of us who are renters. Like, we just move around all the time. Yes, I was evicted many of those times. We could talk about it later. But I think people inside Census are really trying to take a look and see, like, how can they do a better job of counting those folks who are living in those unstable addresses. And the reason for that is, if you think about the census like just at its base level, what we do is like write down all the addresses in the houses in the country and then try to count all the people who are at those addresses. But let's say you're someone like me and you move every 9 months most of the time, then when you're reaching out to me and you put something in the mail that gets sent to my house, like, I'm probably not living there anymore. Whatever you knew about me last year is probably not true for this year, and it becomes much harder to just sort of find me. And you may accidentally find me at my new address, but you also may not, because maybe the mail came at a time when I was like in the process of moving and you couldn't find me. So I think people at Census who have that experience of having lived in a bunch of places are really looking at how can we do a better job at counting these folks who move a lot. And I think we see the same thing with people who have other lived experiences that feed into those undercounts. People who have young kids are really committed to figuring out how we do something different around counting young children in the census, which is, again, another group that's persistently been undercounted. But I think one thing that we really need to work on is making sure that the diversity of lived experience that feeds into these undercounts is then represented inside the Census Bureau. I think historically, those people that are drawn to work in federal government, those people that are recruited from the universities that the Census Bureau has relationships with don't always represent our communities and probably don't represent historically undercounted communities as well as they could or should. So I think one thing that we can do is make sure that we are encouraging people with a diversity of lived experience to pursue these kinds of jobs in federal government, which might not always feel like the best place to work, and to make sure that where we see gaps in the staff at the Census Bureau, that we are supplementing that with good insights from the advocacy community and from people who represent those communities.
If I can just respond
Please do.
to Megan and Janine, we can think like, what does an undercount mean? And at one level, right, it's something where we could say we fix this thing by like counting better, right? Count harder. Or we could fix it by like making the society better in a way as well. Like, and the answer is clearly both. But I think it's a way of thinking about what an undercount means is that it's telling us about real deficits in our society, because it can point out these like real flaws in people not having service, not being able to get access to the internet, and all of these sorts of things. If we're asking people to allow themselves to be made known to a government, we also owe it to them to give them a good government that works for them, right? Like both these things have to happen.
Thanks. Yeah. One last question for you all before we turn to the audience for discussion. Thinking about future censuses, sorry, Dan. I'm wondering, what are some of the innovations that you're anticipating from the Census Bureau, or maybe some things that you can imagine that you would like to see in terms of new creative approaches to addressing some of the challenges of getting to a fair and accurate count?
I can start. We're really excited. We did a pilot project in Mississippi around elections using AI in 2023 to better understand doing community organizing. So Fair Count, we organize 365 days a year, right? So our organizers are talking to people. And so we did this pilot project where we would go to a door, talk to someone, and then use, before going to the next door, record a short voice memo that was then transcribed into text and then fed into into an LLM, large language model, to do sentiment analyses to understand better what people cared about and what people were thinking in the election. What we hope to do is to start to build out another, like a prototype of that we'll be able to use around not just voting, but also census outreach. So being able to go into a community and instead of being like, hey, my name is Janine, have you done your census? You know, I can say, hey, my name is Janine. We've been talking to your neighbors and folks seem to really care about this issue. And then to be able to tie that back to why people should participate in the census. And so that's one thing I'm excited about. Instead of being afraid of our AI overlords taking over and killing us, how can we use AI for good and for the good of our democracy?
That is really exciting. Thank you. Yeah. Megan?
There are about 1,000 pet issues that I would like to see resolved in future censuses, from how we count people who are incarcerated, how we count people who are experiencing homelessness, definitely this renters issues that I just talked about. But my real dream is that we find better connection between the data that we collect and how we use that data. I think we've spent so much time as a community really working hard to get people to fill out the census. We're doing an awesome job. Let's keep at it. But I feel like there are a lot of ways we could be using the data that we already collect to actually move people toward equity. And I think that sometimes those opportunities get missed because the people who have the most expertise about the data don't necessarily have the most expertise about policy and equity, and in how we're sort of serving the American people. And I hope that we can make those connections stronger going forward. That's my dream.
And I would just say, Kara already mentioned this idea that the census is a kind of infrastructure that and what happens if if you don't take care of the pipes, is eventually your water gets poisoned. And if this is the infrastructure that allows people's voices to be heard, that makes it so that all our sample surveys work so that people can be represented it needs to be constantly maintained. And politicians like to put money into things that you can see it happen. And it's a lot harder to have them put money into things where you can't see it operating. But this is the infrastructure for our democracy. So we need people to get their Congress people to allocate funds to the Census Bureau throughout all 10 years in the census cycle.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I was kind of hoping somebody would touch on funding. Yeah, it's kind of important. And I'll just add something that comes to mind hearing you all speak. I think, Bacon, you mentioned this, and Dan, you mentioned Kelly Miller. It took a Black man, Black people, to identify these undercounts of Black men in the census. And I think that just speaks to how important it is that the people who are making all those decisions that I mentioned, the hundreds and thousands of decisions that go into a decennial census, that the folks making those decisions reflect the full diversity of our nation. That's how we're gonna get to the most fair and accurate data. Those folks have to be in those rooms, influencing all of those little decisions. So that's my big dream, right? A Census Bureau, a federal statistical system that sort of matches our diverse nation. And with that, I'd love to open it up for questions. Or first we can give the panel a hand. Let's give the panel a hand. Yeah. All right, questions?
See one over there.
Is there a mic here? There's someone here in the front.
Thank you. I really loved what Megan had to say about separating the idea of the census between the collection of data and then understanding what it means. I feel like you guys really touched on the collection aspect, and I agree, we got to keep pushing forward. But what I really think is really the most difficult part is that sort of this data and what it means is very stigmatized. It's seen as something that you need to educate people on, but its implications can be so important to these communities, and especially when we see the issues of undercounting, and we can extrapolate certain impacts that these communities have, and it's this is underreported, and yet it's still to these percentages. So I guess just any advice that you guys have on how we can kind of make these analysis is less highbrow, if you will, especially for immigrant communities.
Thank you. Anyone want to start?
I think with all things, it's about making it relevant to people. We can have these high-level conversations, and even some of the messaging is the Census Bureau will, the census will direct 1 point or however many trillion dollars in federal funding to, to all the different states every year for the next 10 years. But I think it's about finding, again, why the AI project is really, intriguing to me, is to be able to find things that people actually care about, right, that are relevant to them. That money is not going to go into your pocket, right? But it could make it so that your child isn't taking classes in trailers at their school because there was an undercount of kids, and now they weren't able to allocate enough space for registrations for the school, and now the school is overcrowded. It could be as much as anything that is relevant. And I think that's a bigger part of the issue with democracy, is that people aren't seeing how democracy works in their daily lives. And as long as we can start to make those connections where it really matters to people, then you can get out of the sky with all of this talk and actually make it relevant so that people are more likely to participate and more likely to want to learn more about how it impacts them every day.
I mean, also, I think there's a real possibility that you just don't need to talk about numbers very much with people.
Facts.
Right? I mean, it's also, numbers are a language of power, and it could very well be that they're for making arguments to Congress people, but that there are other ways to make the message that allow you to take what we have all learned to make a case without having to worry about the actual statistics.
Yeah. I think when I was in law school, I taught a class called Street Law, where you go into local high schools and you teach kids about the law. And I realized on day one that the best approach to doing that was to just make it relevant to the actual individual young people that were sitting in front of me. And so we spent day one talking about what their experiences had been with law enforcement, with the court system, whether they'd had families that had been impacted by the criminal legal system. And then we taught the class to just teach them about all of the things that they had brought up on day one. And I think that that's how census work has to happen too. Like, I think we need to talk to people about what they care about and then find the connections in the data itself, or in the connections between the data and policy that are relevant to them, and go from there. I know we all are always looking for scalable solutions and all that, but I think in this instance, like, a lot of it is about us being translators and creating bespoke resources for the folks in our own communities that are relevant to them.
I'll see some questions over here on this side.
And then there's a lady in the back who keeps raising.
Hey y'all, I'm Rebecca, self-proclaimed census nerd, but I don't know if everyone in this room is. And so one thing that I'm really worried about, I was just watching the House Oversight Committee on Census and what we lived through in 2020, is this very real, very threatening move to cull undocumented people from the 2030 count. And that fight is something that is happening now. It's very, very real. And so just because I think it's important for everybody here, can you all talk a little bit about sort of the terrible impacts that might have on the data collection and how we would go forward as a nation with a strong democracy should that be successful before 2030?
I'm happy to start. I will then quickly turn it over to my colleagues who are even more expert. Again, I think if we took 10 steps back and asked the question, is it important for us to have good data and information about people in this country, whether they are citizens or not, whatever their immigration status is? I think most of us would say it would be helpful to know more about immigration status so that we could better serve those communities. I think if we know that that data is going to be misused, it both impacts whether people are willing to participate in a survey and creates potential for very harmful outcomes if the data are misused. So I think one of the things I try to do is make sure that we're, again, making sure that the legal protections on use of that data are shored up, even if we can't prevent the addition of a citizenship question to the 2030 census. We do need to make sure that that data can't be misused. And I think if we are in a different political situation in 2030, that relying on the same messages that we've always relied on, that it's important for us to be collecting data on the communities that are in most need of support in order to be able to support them well, might help us turn the tide on how people experience responding to those questions.
I would just say the 14th Amendment of the Constitution says all persons will be counted. At the height of Jim Crow, when the Ku Klux Klan was like at its apex, people in Congress from Mississippi knew that they needed a constitutional amendment to try to kick out non-citizens from the count. They recognized that. 100 years later, it's still the same case. So, I mean, I know that might not work, but we should remember that all persons are going to be counted. That's just the law.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. There is someone, she has raised her hand like 5 times.
Yeah.
We can see you from up here.
Hello, my name's Sylvia. I'm with Common Cause. So, we're talking about the census. There's kind of the count and then the manipulation of the count. And I'm actually interested in any historical information, Dan, that you could maybe provide to us, right? We know now that thanks to Common Cause v. Rucho, Supreme Court says that political gerrymandering is non-judiciable. And we know that prison gerrymandering is a major issue. And we know that politicians like power and holding on to power. So when we look at the past and how the census undercounted people, when and how did those policies change? Like in the 40s, I can't imagine they went, oh, we should count all black people because then we can give black communities more money. Like I can't imagine that was like a yay. So I'm just wondering, like, what kind of political will or what what are the things that have happened in the past that have helped us move to counting people and ensuring that they receive representation in a more fair and equitable way.
Right. Yeah, to your point, the Census Bureau from the 50 census on starts to much more accurately measure the undercounts, but it's the civil rights movement, it's the Voting Rights Act, it's actual legislation that then forces a change in how that census data is being used. It's people forcing the political system to do something. Now, when you start talking about gerrymandering and how to get around this might be a little bit of a hedge way around this, but Congress has given up a lot of its responsibilities, and it should be forced to take them back up. So one of the reasons that we find census cases so frequently in the courts is because Congress has tried to say, we're just going to let the numbers speak for themselves. The Census Bureau produces some data, and then that data will determine apportionment. That data will be used to draw these maps. And while there's a certain feeling of objectivity that comes with that, like setting up this process, it also means that our major political body, Congress, which could actually make this decision, is like moving out of the firing line, dodging us responsibility. And if Congress instead made these processes no longer something that were happening outside of its own power, but it created its own rules about how gerrymandering should be removed, removed the automatic system of apportioning House seats, then things would change and the courts couldn't do anything about it, because then it would actually be Congress who makes the law of the land doing this kind of thing. That doesn't answer your question, but that's the direction that the movement would have to push. Actually, I think it's actually towards making Congress take responsibility for the ways it has failed to create a system that outlaws gerrymandering, that creates compact, equitable districts, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Did anyone else
Yeah,
want to
any better answers?
add to that?
I'll just say on the other side of that, right? Like gerrymandering is the bad version of this, but our ability to create districts that are weirdly shaped, I think probably maybe came from us wanting to build communities of interest that could elect people who look like us to Congress, right? So I think that it's a tough question of whether we look to Congress to say, let's just divide the United States into a grid and create compact districts that are more sort of sensible to us, but then maybe remove our ability to create communities of interest. So I think it's a tough question, and I would love to hear more from you all about how we solve it.
Yeah. Right here, we have.
So my question is more centered on the future of what the census will look like specifically. So coming in 2030, obviously more Gen Zers will be filling out the census than have been in the past. So combining that alongside, obviously people who are in lower income households typically have more busy days, they are more stressed, and they have less time to fill out the census than upper class communities. So I'm just wondering, how can we make the census simpler or easier to fill out? Because to be honest, like my generation, as well as busy people in general, like they're not going to sit down and fill out a long form, I'm afraid. So like what does the future of the census look like in a country that not only is now struggling with great class inequality, but also from insanely like decreasing attention spans at the same time? Like I think it's weird that I'm connecting those two, I think, but you know, I think they both produce the same problem of how do we make the census more accessible to people as well?
It's a great question.
Well, you know, first is the internet, like making it available to people. Because what is it, 10 questions?
10 questions?
Yes, it's just 10 questions. Like the American Community Survey, which everyone needs to participate in, is the long, that one's long. But everybody still needs to do it, okay? But it's 10 questions. And even in 2020, I felt like there were some organizations and leaders out there that were trying to, make it fun, especially when COVID hit and people were just like sitting at home, like, go ahead, yeah, let's do it together. But it really doesn't take that long to do. But for your, thinking about what social media and what technologies will be around, in 2030, who knows, right? They're going to take our TikTok away, and that's fine. But I wonder if there are ways that we could get, we could use influencers to, encourage people to participate, or do some sort of like online initiatives to get younger folks to actually do it. But I really don't know what the future is. I mean, it doesn't seem like it's that far away, but technology is quick, so it'll be interesting to see what's around in 2030.
Yeah, and also my answer to this question is always community organizing. That's that's the answer. Is how we get people to do this is getting people who you trust to ask to ask their friends and colleagues to do it. I don't know that there is any other real solution than us organizing ourselves to be part of our civic engagement. I wish there was a easier answer. But.
No, I mean, actually, that's so much the answer, right? In part because, well, for one, right, please help us to get out the word that it's actually a really short, firm form.
Same question.
It's really short. But that doesn't mean people should do it together, because some of the questions turn out to be a little bit complicated, only in the sense that, they're really hard questions about how to answer them right. For instance, white people like me lost it in 2020 because they were suddenly asked what kind of white person they were. Which is a question that we ask all kinds of other people, but we don't ask ourselves. And suddenly it's, And this is a moment for consciousness raising, right? To realize all God's children have race, right? And that in fact we have to figure out what that means to have race. And it would be a great place to be sitting together and thinking about what does this mean? And also, how can I answer this strategically? Because I might choose a variety of honest, appropriate, marked down racial identities, but then I'm going to get put in a box of multiracial or more than one in a lot of statistics, and it might be more important for me to think, what identity of mine is most important to my local community, and choose that as a primary one, and only choose that one for the purpose of making sure that I'm more visible in the statistics. Now, what person could possibly know that unless they're a true census nerd? Which is
I think about.
Which is why it would be really useful to have people meeting together to fill out their censuses.
Yeah. I'll add one more thing, which is I think you're right that low-income people tend to not have a lot of time to do stuff like fill out a survey. But part of the reason, at least in my experience, is because we spend so much time waiting for things that we need. So waiting in line at the SNAP office for an entire day, or waiting for your landlord to pick up the phone so that you can get them to come get rid of all the roaches, for example, just an example. And I think some of the folks who I saw that did really successful organizing in 2020 took advantage of those places where low-income folks are sitting, waiting, bored, and let them use that time in a way that was helping their own community by filling out the census. So we organized at SNAP offices, we organized at WIC offices, we organized at public housing spots where people were just sitting, waiting. We also organized in the line for the bar, So whatever people are doing where they're just waiting and wasting time is a great place to sort of take advantage when people really have the time to do it.
Yeah.
We might have time for one more question. Can we go over here? Right here, yes.
Okay. I didn't want to take anybody's microphone. You mentioned local media and news deserts, especially in the South, and how 75% of counties in the South are considered news deserts, and 85% of folks in the South are at risk of losing their local news. But I remember in 2020 in California, there was an initiative to leverage the trust that local newsrooms have, especially community and ethnic news, to reach people about the census, and it was really successful. And in fact, California governments are still leveraging local media to reach public information. But I wonder if there's more that local media could be doing in the interim. It's 10 years. Censuses are important throughout the 10 years, not just when people are filling them out. What stories or engagement would you like to see from local media, and this could go for all three of you, in this interim period to reinforce both the importance of the census, not just when it needs to be filled out, but also reinforce to folks that you do need to fill it out?
I'm always going to talk about stories, right? And so if local media can, if you can go and find relevant stories to do an op-ed or an editorial, well, that's the same thing, to do an editorial or to talk to people that, participated in the census, I think that would be wonderful to have those stories there. Another thing that I think is going to be key and that local media would be instrumental in helping do is to get people jobs at the Census Bureau. So a big part of getting people counted is having these enumerators and partnership specialists that are going into the community and working to try and get people to get counted. But you're more likely to answer the door or to have a conversation with someone who looks like they're from your community, that a trusted voice. And I remember after the census, we were in Mississippi, which is where I'm from, and I was in the Mississippi Delta, and I was talking to an elected official there, and he was so pissed because he was just like, we tried to get people jobs, like we did job fairs, and none of our folks got hired for these jobs. And so maybe, I don't know, I think there could potentially be, like, write a story about the fact that you had 20 people from this small town in the Delta apply for census jobs and none of them got hired, right? Or write a story about someone who was hired and they were super effective in making sure that their community was counted. But I think those, again, it all comes down to stories that people can relate to and actually putting that information out there. Uh-huh. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'd say there's probably more than 10 years worth of stories about your local community in the data. Mm-hmm. So yes, 100% we should be covering stories about people who participated in the census and who were taking the census, but also oh my God, wouldn't you like to know the sort of breakdown of the demographics of your community in a more detailed way? You can know that from the census. And if you run out of stories from the decennial census, you can look into stories from the American Community Survey, which also gives you an extraordinary amount of rich detail about local communities. So, and if you name the census when you're telling those stories instead of just telling those stories as if they came out of the ether, then I think it helps people to connect the value of what they're doing.
One story that came from a Census Bureau, former Census Bureau worker, she was saying, and this is one of the first things she told me when I got into this space, that there was a community that they were a food desert. And that part of the reason, an actual major grocery chain had come to the community to scope it out, but their population was just under the threshold for what they would use to invest in putting that supermarket in that community. That's the kind of story that I think should be out there. And I know that there are likely more examples of that, but if you can say, I have to get all my groceries from Dollar General, and I can't go to a Kroger or a Publix, and it's because my community was not counted accurately, that would encourage me to participate and put that in the newspaper. Yeah.
Thank you for the question. All right. Any final thoughts before we wrap up the panel here?
Census all day, every day. Tell all your friends.
Yes.
I'll lean on Dan's metaphor and say, data's not the revolution, but it's real hard to do the revolution without data.
Yes. Snaps.
Amen.
And I'll just say Dan's book is on sale on the 4th floor, and he's signing copies. So just putting that out there.
I also have a census stamp.
Okay. And thank you all so much for being here, and let's thank the panel one more time.